I'm about to go see the parents of the only true friend my child ever had, and the reason will break your heart. I thought this visit would be a thank you, but it's turning into something I can barely bring myself to face. There are moments in life you spend years preparing for. Graduations, weddings, the first time your child says, "I love you." But no one prepares you for this kind of moment. I parked a few streets away from their house because I needed a minute to think, to breathe, to remember. The air was cool, the kind that sits still after a long day, heavy with the smell of rain that never came. I sat there for a while, watching life go on outside my car window. A woman hurried past with grocery bags cutting into her wrists. Two teenagers laughed as they balanced on their bikes, their voices echoing down the block. A man jogged by, earbuds in, lost in his own rhythm, his own world. And for a second, I wondered, have any of them ever stood where I'm standing? Have they ever carried news that could shatter the people they're walking home to? Have they ever had to say thank you and goodbye in the same breath? They all looked so normal, like their hearts weren't breaking, like their worlds were still intact. And honestly, I envied that. The simplicity of it. The freedom of not knowing what it feels like to carry a story that heavy. Every car that passed felt like a reminder that life doesn't wait for anyone to catch up. And maybe that's why I finally opened the door and started walking, one slow step at a time, toward the house that held the hardest truth I'd ever have to speak. I thought I knew what I'd say when I saw them, but now, standing this close, I don't. Because the truth is, this story didn't begin here, on this quiet street. It began years ago, in hospital rooms, empty classrooms, and nights so still I could hear my son's heartbeat from the hallway. Let me just back up a little and tell you how all this came about. Most importantly, let me tell you about my son. His name is Rick, and from the moment he arrived, he filled every corner of my life with noise. The good kind. The kind that sounds like toy cars scraping across the kitchen floor or giggles from behind a door he swore was a secret base. He had this way of asking questions that made you forget how heavy the world could be. "Mom," he'd say, "if clouds can hold rain, do they ever get tired?" Or, "How many hugs do you think it takes to make someone happy forever?" He was curious about everything. Ants, airplanes, even the cracks in the wall. He said they looked like maps to hidden places. And in those early years, I believed he'd find them all, because that's what you do when you have a child like Rick. You believe in a world big enough for him. Then came that day, the one where everything we thought we knew about our lives tilted, just slightly at first, but enough to never be the same again. It started with a doctor's office that smelled too clean and a chair that felt too small for the weight of what he was about to say. He used words I didn't recognize at first, medical terms that blurred together until all I could hear was the space between them. Then one phrase stuck, one that split the room in half: developmental disorder, with significant cognitive and social challenges. I remember nodding, like I understood, because that's what you do when the world starts spinning and you're trying not to fall off. Rick was in the corner, playing with a toy truck, humming to himself, and I remember thinking, how can something so perfect suddenly be labeled as less? That night, I sat beside his bed watching him sleep. He looked peaceful, like he didn't know the world had just changed its rules for him. I promised him right there, whispering into the dark, that he would still have everything: a normal childhood, friends who saw him, a school that believed in him. But the world doesn't keep promises the way a mother does. The first rejection came a month later, a polite email with too many commas and not enough heart. "We're so sorry. At this time, we don't have the resources to accommodate your child's needs." I stared at that sentence until the words stopped meaning anything. I thought, Okay, maybe the next one. But the next one came with a smile that hurt to look at. The principal shook my hand, spoke gently, said all the right things. He's such a lovely boy. We wish we could. We're just not equipped. And then the third school. Same words, same sorry smile. Only this time, Rick was with me. He clutched his new backpack, a bright blue covered in planets, and asked if he'd meet friends there. I didn't know how to answer, so I told him maybe, always maybe. Each rejection felt like watching a door close a few inches more, and every time it did, the light in him dimmed a little. At night, I'd sit by the computer, sending emails to schools across the city, typing until my fingers hurt. Please, just give him a chance. I told myself if I begged long enough, someone would listen. Days turned into weeks, my inbox filled with silence and sympathy, and I started to measure time in how many doors we hadn't opened yet. Then one afternoon, after another, I'm sorry. Rick tugged at my sleeve. His voice was small, smaller than I'd ever heard it. Why doesn't anyone want me, Mama? I wanted to tell him the truth, that people can be afraid of what they don't understand, but he was too young to carry that kind of truth. So I said something else, something weak and wrong. Maybe they just don't know you yet. He nodded and went back to his drawings. Only this time they were quiet ones. No more rockets or smiling suns. Just small houses with no doors. That was when the numbness began to settle in, a kind of stillness that feels like drowning without water. You start to fight less, speak less, believe less, because fighting a system that won't fight for you, it drains you in ways you can't describe. Some nights, after he'd fallen asleep, I'd sit by the window and watch the streetlights. Each one flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. And I understood that feeling. I kept telling myself I could fix this, that if I just tried harder, someone would see him the way I did. But somewhere between the phone calls and the rejections, I started to believe they were right. Maybe he couldn't do this. Maybe I'd been wrong about how strong love really was. And that's where the cracks began. Not just in the world around us, but inside me too. I thought we'd hit rock bottom with the rejections. I was wrong. Because sometimes life doesn't collapse all at once. It starts with a crack, so small you almost don't notice. And by the time you do, the ground beneath you has already given way. That morning felt ordinary, the kind of morning that would later haunt me for how normal it was. Rick was at the kitchen table tracing circles in his cereal bowl. He'd started doing that lately. Patterns, loops, shapes, only he understood. I was running late, packing his lunch, half listening as he hummed to himself. He asked me if I thought the sun ever got lonely. I laughed, said, with all those planets around, never. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I see that now, that tiny flicker that should have told me something was wrong. But in the moment, I just kissed the top of his head and told him I'd be back early. That's the thing about hindsight. It's cruel. It turns the smallest details into screams. The rest of the day was a blur of errands and phone calls, another school meeting, another carefully worded rejection. I remember feeling angry, not at them, but at the world, at how easy it was for people to give up on a child who hadn't even been given a chance. By the time I got home, the sky had dimmed. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong. I called his name, once, then twice. No answer. The TV was still on. His backpack lay open on the floor, one shoe in the hallway. And then I saw it. The bathroom door. Closed. I don't remember opening it. I just remember the sound that left my throat when I did. It wasn't a scream, not really. It was something deeper, rawer, something I didn't know a human voice could make. Rick was on the floor, still, so terribly still. Everything after that is pieces. Flashing red lights, voices shouting, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't dial my husband's number. The ambulance siren was the longest sound I've ever heard. It felt like it would never end. I remember holding his hand, whispering his name over and over, like I could anchor him with it. I told him to stay, told him I was sorry, told him he wasn't alone. And then, when words stopped working, I started to bargain. Please, God, I'll do anything. Take everything, just not him. It wasn't prayer. It was begging, the kind that comes from somewhere between madness and love. When we reached the hospital, they rushed him away, and suddenly there was nothing left for me to do but sit. That waiting room. I can still see it. The peeling paint, the vending machine that hummed too loud, the woman across from me crying quietly into her hands, a stranger whose pain felt familiar. Hours passed, though time didn't exist there. It was just silence and the sound of my own heartbeat, a reminder that I was still here, and he might not be. Every second was a punishment, because the truth kept looping in my head. I was so focused on schools rejecting him. I didn't see that I was failing him. All those nights I sat writing emails, fighting for a place that would accept him. But I never stopped to ask if he still felt accepted by me, if he felt seen, if he still believed he was enough. That's the part that breaks you, realizing you were trying to save someone from the world, when what they needed most was saving from the silence inside their own heart. He survived. They said it softly, as though saying it too loud might change it. He's stable. I remember collapsing right there on the cold floor. My knees gave out, and all I could think was, thank you, thank you, thank you. But underneath that relief was guilt. Thick, heavy, unrelenting guilt. The next days were a blur of wires and monitors and beeping machines. He looked so small in that hospital bed. Bandaged arms, eyes closed, but alive. The nurses called him a miracle. I couldn't bring myself to agree, because miracles are supposed to bring peace, and I felt anything but. When he finally opened his eyes, I wanted to hold him. But something stopped me. He looked at me like I was someone he didn't quite recognize, and maybe, in that moment, I wasn't his mother. Maybe I was the person who hadn't seen his pain soon enough. They let us go home a week later. He walked slower, spoke less. The light that used to follow him, the one that filled our home, was dim. He spent hours staring out the window, tracing shapes on the glass with his finger. Circles again. Always circles. I tried everything. Toys, stories, his favorite songs. Nothing reached him. It was like talking to someone through thick glass. You can see them, you can love them, but you can't reach them. At night, I'd check on him every hour, afraid to sleep, afraid to find silence again. I started leaving the hallway light on, a soft glow like a promise. I'm here. I'm watching. But the truth is, I wasn't living. I was existing in fear. And fear makes a poor parent. How do you parent when you can't protect them from themselves? I stopped answering calls, stopped seeing friends, food lost its taste, days blurred together. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from watching your child retreat into a world you can't follow. It's worse than grief, because at least grief has a beginning and an end. This was an ache that just stayed. Some nights, I'd stand at his doorway and whisper apologies he'd never hear, for not noticing, for not asking, for believing love alone was enough. I wanted to believe we could find our way back to before the rejections, before the silence, before I failed him, but I didn't know how. Still, somewhere in that darkness, a quiet thought began to grow. A question, really, one that I didn't have an answer to yet. What if the world that kept closing its doors to him wasn't the only world out there? I didn't know then that salvation would come from the most unexpected place, that someone, something, would find us in that silence and remind us what hope could sound like. Healing never arrives with a grand announcement. Sometimes it shows up in the smallest, most ordinary moments, like a Tuesday afternoon at a community center you almost didn't go to. It had been months since the hospital. Rick still barely spoke. His world had shrunk to the walls of our home, and every morning I'd wonder if he'd ever want to step outside them again. A counselor suggested a community art program. Neutral ground, she said. No pressure, no labels, just paint, paper, and maybe a little light. I didn't believe it would help, but I went anyway, because that's what desperate mothers do. We show up even when hope feels impossible. The room smelled like tempera paint and disinfectant. Children hunched over tables, dipping brushes into water cups, smearing color onto paper like their hearts depended on it. Rick sat at the edge, silent, his hand hovering above the page. He didn't move, didn't look up. And then, there he was. A boy I hadn't noticed before, tall for his age, maybe 12. Messy brown hair, a blue hoodie a size too big. There was a brightness in his face, not loud, not forced, the kind that came from seeing people. He walked right up to Rick and said, "Hey, you're holding that brush like it's a sword. Are you a knight or something?" I froze. No one had spoken to Rick that directly in months. Most people didn't know how. Rick looked up, just looked, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. He didn't answer, of course, but the boy, Matt, didn't seem to mind. He just sat beside him and started painting. A big, messy, lopsided dragon. "Knights need dragons," he said with a grin, "and dragons need friends." I stood there, pretending to scroll through my phone, but really I was watching every tiny movement. Rick's fingers twitched, his shoulders loosened, and then the smallest thing happened. He dipped his brush into the blue paint and added a sky behind Matt's dragon. No words, just color. It was the first color I'd seen him choose since everything fell apart. That was the first moment I thought, maybe he's still in there. After the session, Matt's mother came over. She had kind eyes, the kind that had known both love and loss. Her name was Carol. We talked about nothing at first, schedules, snacks, the weather. But beneath it, there was an understanding. Two mothers who'd both spent too many nights holding their breath. A week later, she told me something that stopped me cold. Matt had a terminal illness, a rare form of bone cancer. The doctors didn't know how long he had. I remember nodding, but the world tilted. This boy, the one who smiled like sunlight, the one who'd found my son in his silence, was dying. I couldn't make sense of it. How someone with so little time left could give so much life away. But Matt didn't move through the world like he was dying. He laughed loud, asked too many questions, and always saved the last cookie for whoever was closest. He wasn't afraid of silence, and that's what made him different. He didn't fill the gaps. He sat in them, waited, let Rick come to him. And slowly, unbelievably, Rick did. Week after week, they found each other in that noisy room. While the other kids painted flowers or trees, Matt and Rick built worlds, knights, dragons, castles, storms, whole stories in color. Sometimes I'd catch them whispering, Matt doing most of the talking, Rick smiling just enough to let me know he was listening. It wasn't a miracle. It was something better. It was ordinary connection. No therapy could have done that. No medicine. Just one boy who saw another. Eventually, I met Matt's dad too, Daniel. He had that quiet kind of strength that comes from holding up the people you love, even when you're falling apart yourself. Their family had learned to live between hospital visits and good days, and still, somehow, they radiated warmth. I remember thinking, how do you smile when you know what's coming? But maybe that's what love does. It teaches you to hold joy, even when it's temporary. The weeks turned into months. Matt kept coming back. Even on the days when he was pale, tired, when I knew he'd probably had another treatment, he'd still show up, grinning, saying, "I promised my knight I'd bring the dragons today." And each time I'd feel that mix of gratitude and terror twisting inside me because I watched my son come alive again. And I was terrified. What if this friend left? What if my son lost him? I'd seen what loss could do to Rick, how it hollowed him out. I didn't think he could survive another goodbye. But then I'd see them laugh. Genuine, unguarded laughter. The kind that shakes the walls, the kind that reminds you what it means to be alive. And I realized I couldn't protect him from joy out of fear of future pain. That's not living. That's surviving. And he'd done enough of that already. One afternoon, after another painting session, Matt turned to me and said he should come to my school. My heart sank. Those words, they sounded innocent, but to me they were a trapdoor leading straight back into pain. I wanted to say no, to protect Rick, to protect myself, because I knew what would come next. Forms, meetings, the inevitable, "We're sorry." I looked at Rick. His face was glowing, hopeful in a way I hadn't seen in so long. He was looking at Matt, not me, waiting for my answer. And in that moment, I realized that fear was about me, not him. I was afraid of another rejection, but he was ready to try again. So I smiled, even though my chest ached, and said, "We'll see." Matt grinned. "You'll see," he said back, with the kind of confidence only kids can have. Everybody needs a knight in their class. That night, I stood at Rick's doorway. He was sketching something. 2 stick figures, a dragon in between. He didn't notice me watching. For the first time in months, I saw something flicker in him again. A spark that wasn't about surviving the next day, but looking forward to it. And I thought, maybe, just maybe this boy, this bright, fragile, extraordinary boy named Matt, wasn't here to save my son. Maybe he was here to remind him how to save himself. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself hope. There are battles you expect to fight as a mother. Scraped knees, bad grades, broken hearts. But this fight, I'd been fighting it for so long, I forgot what it felt like to have anyone beside me. When Matt said Rick should come to his school, I smiled because I didn't want to crush that hope. But inside, I was already bracing for the fall. I'd been down that road too many times. The meetings, the polite refusals, the sympathy that never turned into action. I'd learned to armor my heart before every "we're sorry." But then, something unexpected happened. Matt didn't let it go. He and his parents, Carol and Daniel, took it on like it was personal. They fought for my son like he was their own. They called the school. They spoke to the board. They asked questions I'd stopped asking, pushed doors I'd stopped knocking on. I remember sitting in a meeting one afternoon, Matt there in his blue hoodie, sketchbook in hand, listening carefully as adults tossed around words like resources and liability. And then he spoke, quietly, but with a strength that filled the room. He said, "You keep saying what you don't have, but maybe if Rick comes, you'll find what you've been missing." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed like truth. And for the first time, I saw one of those administrators actually pause, like they'd forgotten they were talking about a child. After the meeting, I pulled Carol aside. I told her they didn't have to do this, that it wasn't their responsibility, that they'd already done enough. She took my hand and said, "Let us do this. You've carried this alone too long." I didn't realize how heavy it had become until someone offered to lift it. Her words cracked something open in me. The years of exhaustion, the fear, the constant pretending that I was fine. I wanted to say thank you, but what came out instead was a quiet sob. Because gratitude, it can be as painful as grief when you don't feel you deserve it. I watched Matt keep showing up, even on his tired days. Even when the treatments left his hands trembling, he'd still walk into those rooms like he belonged there, like fighting for someone else made him forget his own pain. And I'd stand there, watching this boy who had every reason to give up. use his strength to give my son a chance at a life he might never get to see himself. How do you thank someone for that? How do you live with the weight of that kind of kindness? Then one morning, Carol called. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that means something big has happened. "They said yes," she whispered. "The school's agreed. Rick's been accepted." I didn't speak at first. I just sat there, holding the phone like it might vanish. After years of hearing no, the word yes didn't sound real. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, almost sacred, and before I knew it, I was crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for years and finally remember how to exhale. I told Rick that night. He just stared at me, confused, cautious, like he didn't trust it either. Then he looked at me and said, "Matt's school?" And when I nodded, he smiled. It was small, but it was there. A real smile. In the days that followed, I prepared him the way only a mother can. Labeled his supplies, laid out his clothes, tried to hide the tremor in my hands, and beneath every small joy, there was fear. What if it doesn't work? What if they're cruel? What if he gets hurt again? But then I'd remember Matt, his steady voice, his quiet confidence, and I'd think, maybe this time, it's different. The morning of the first day arrived. Rick stood by the window, backpack too big, his hair still messy the way he liked it. He was nervous, I could tell by how tightly he gripped the straps. Then a horn honked outside. Matt. He was in the passenger seat of his mom's car, grinning wide, waving like he was welcoming royalty. "Come on, Sir Rick," he shouted through the open window. "We're going to be late to our kingdom." Rick rolled his eyes, but he went. He climbed into that car, and I watched them drive off together. I stood at the gate, watching their silhouettes disappear down the street, and for the first time in a long, long time, I finally exhaled. I didn't know what the future would hold, whether this school would be kind, whether this fragile hope would last. But in that moment, watching my son and the boy who saw him walk into that new world together, it didn't matter, because for the first time, Rick wasn't walking alone. For a while, life almost felt normal again. Report cards, school events, play dates, words that used to belong to other families. Suddenly, they belonged to us too. Rick was thriving. He came home with paint on his sleeves, stories on his tongue. He laughed again, loudly, unguarded, the kind of laugh that filled the walls. And at the center of it all was Matt, always Matt. They were inseparable. If Rick wasn't talking about him, he was with him. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe we'd made it, that maybe the worst was behind us. Carol and I grew close too. It started with quick chats during pickup, then coffee after drop-off, then long afternoons where words just spilled out. We talked about everything: motherhood, fear, guilt, faith. And somewhere between the laughter and the silence, I realized she understood me in a way no one else did. Two mothers, both living on borrowed time. Mine measured in recovery, hers measured in days. I started noticing it first in small ways. Matt's steps slowing, his hoodie hanging looser, the way he'd press his hand against his side when he thought no one was watching. One morning, he didn't come to school. Rick noticed before I did. He waited by the classroom door, backpack still on, eyes scanning every face that passed. That afternoon, Carol called. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. "He wanted this year," she said quietly. "He wanted to give your son this." I sat there, phone in hand, staring at nothing. The words sank slow, heavy and merciless. He was dying, and he spent his final energy on my son. It's a strange kind of grief, realizing the person who saved your child might not be there much longer. It's gratitude and heartbreak, tangled together until you can't tell them apart. Weeks passed. Matt came to school less often, but every time he did, the world seemed to light up again. Teachers smiled more. Even the air felt lighter. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. It was the school. Matt had collapsed. We drove straight to the hospital. Rick didn't say a word the whole ride. When we arrived, he ran ahead, his small figure swallowed by those white hallways. And there he was. Matt. Pale. Tired. Tubes running from his arms. But smiling when he saw Rick. "Hey, Knight," he whispered. "Still painting dragons?" Rick didn't answer. He just climbed onto the chair beside the bed and pulled a book from his bag. It was the story they'd been writing together, knights, dragons, and a friendship that never ended. He started to read, his voice small at first, then stronger. Page after page, hour after hour, every day we came back, and every day I watched my son read his heart out to the boy who had once given him his voice back. Carol and Daniel never complained, never said, "It's not fair." They smiled, they held his hand, they loved with a grace that felt too big for this world. And I would watch them and wonder, how? How were they so graceful when their world was ending? One night, I stayed outside the room while Rick read. The hallway lights were dim. Everything was quiet except for his voice drifting through the door. Then it went still, and I heard Matt say, barely above a whisper, "Promise you'll keep going. Promise me." There was a pause, and then my son, my quiet, gentle boy, said, "I promise." I pressed my hand against the doorframe, and for the first time I realized Matt wasn't just leaving Rick with memories. He was leaving him with purpose. They say some people are only meant to stay for a while, to remind us what light looks like before they go. And that's what Matt did. He borrowed time and used every moment of it to give my son a lifetime. And as I watched them together, I finally understood something I'd never been brave enough to believe, that love isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it changes you. It was 3 a.m. when the phone rang. But the truth is, I already knew. You know that kind of knowing that doesn't come from sound. It comes from silence. That heavy, unnatural quiet that wakes you before the world does. I stared at the phone for a long time. It kept ringing. And in that space between each ring, I felt the world shift. When I finally picked up, Carol's voice was barely there. She didn't have to say it. I heard everything in the pause between her words. Matt was gone. I sat there in the dark, the phone pressed to my chest, and for a moment I couldn't tell where my heartbeat ended and hers began. Telling Rick was, I don't think words exist for that kind of moment. He was sitting at the kitchen table, still half asleep, hair sticking out in every direction, and I just stood there trying to find a way to break a child without destroying him completely. When I told him, he didn't cry right away. He just looked at me. Like maybe I'd say it was a mistake. Like maybe we could pretend the phone never rang. And then, all at once, he folded into my arms. Shaking, gasping, silent sobs that came from a place deeper than breath. I held him. And for the first time, I realized that grief and love sound the same when they break open. The days after that were a blur. Funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, condolences that all sounded the same. I moved through it all like a ghost. But Rick, he was the one who surprised me. He said, I want to speak at the service. I told him he didn't have to. He looked at me and said, I promised him. The morning of the funeral, the sky was gray. Not stormy, not bright, just suspended. Even the air felt like it didn't know what to do. Carol and Daniel stood at the front, holding each other's hands so tightly it looked like they were keeping each other from falling. When it was Rick's turn, he walked up to the podium, small shoulders, trembling hands. He unfolded a crumpled paper, looked out at the crowd, and for a second, I thought he might run. But then he took a breath and started to speak. He talked about dragons, about adventures that never ended, about a boy who saw him when the world didn't. He stumbled over words, paused to cry, but he never stopped. And in that moment, I realized my son was stronger than me. When it ended, people clapped softly. Carol's face was wet, Daniel's hands were shaking, and Rick just stood there, staring at the casket, whispering something only Matt could hear. At the reception, I couldn't bring myself to speak to them. We exchanged glances across the room, Carol's eyes meeting mine, full of something between forgiveness and exhaustion. So much unsaid, so much I wanted to tell her. Thank you for my son. I'm so sorry for yours. But the words stuck somewhere behind my ribs, so I didn't go to them. I just watched. And when it was time to leave, I slipped out quietly, like a coward. Days turned into weeks. People moved on. The world went back to its rhythm, but I couldn't. Every time I saw Rick laugh, every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, the guilt tightened. They gave me my son back, and I couldn't even face them. Some debts aren't meant to be repaid. Some are meant to be carried. Like a quiet prayer you never stop whispering. Every day I told myself the same 2 sentences. I need to visit them. I can't visit them. Those words became my rhythm, the push and pull of guilt and fear. Because how do you walk into a house where your child's laughter still echoes? But theirs has gone silent. Rick was thriving. School newsletters with his name on them, drawings taped to the fridge, laughter returning to our home like sunlight through old curtains. Every smile of his was a miracle and a reminder, because each joy he had was borrowed from a boy who could no longer have it. I tried to write to them, so many times. Letters that started with thank you and ended with tear stains. But every time I got to the part where I had to say what their son meant to mine, I froze, because words felt too small, and my gratitude too heavy. Rick would ask sometimes, "When are we going to see them again?" I'd smile and say, "Soon, sweetheart." But soon became someday, and someday became never. I told myself I was protecting them, giving them space, letting them grieve. But the truth? I was protecting me, because I didn't know how to sit in their grief when I was holding the very thing they'd lost. Then one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Carol. Her voice was gentle, like always. She said, "We'd love to see you both." Just like that. No guilt, no hesitation, only kindness. The kind that feels heavier than blame. I said yes before my fear could answer for me. And the moment I hung up, the countdown began. 3 days of dread, 3 nights of rehearsing what I'd say. But every version ended the same way, with silence. And that's what brought me here, to this car, to this quiet street, to this impossible moment, where gratitude feels like a burden I'll never set down, and love feels like both the wound and the cure. I parked a few streets away from their house because I needed a minute to think, to breathe, to remember. And just like that, we're back here. The car, the silence, the house at the end of the street, waiting. I sat there a little longer than I meant to, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart whispering all the words I'd never said. Then I opened the door, one slow step at a time. The gravel crunching under my shoes sounded too loud, like the world was holding its breath with me. When the door opened, Carol stood there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached for me, and we just held on. No words, just 2 mothers, one carrying a miracle, the other carrying a memory. Inside, the living room was full of him. Pictures on the mantel, drawings taped to the fridge, his laugh still echoing in the corners if you listened closely enough. I tried to speak. "I'm so sorry, I don't know how to—" But Carol shook her head, tears in her eyes. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Seeing your son live is our thank you." Then Daniel, her husband, looked at me and said, "He was so proud of what he did. You gave our boy purpose in his final months." And that's when it hit me. We saved each other's children, just in different ways. Rick's laughter carried from the backyard where he was playing with their younger kids. Life, stubborn and beautiful, still finding a way to bloom in the cracks. When it was time to leave, Carol hugged me again. "Don't wait so long next time," she whispered, and I knew I wouldn't. On the drive home, Rick leaned his head against the window and said, "That wasn't so bad, was it, Mom?" I smiled, eyes wet but heart light. "No, baby," I whispered. "It wasn't." His friend gave him life. The least I could do was witness their grief, and in that witness, we both found a way forward.